Marci, thank you so much for joining us for this piece of the Permission Granted retreat. I'm really glad to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, this is going to be a good conversation. One of the things that I want to start off right away is talking about the stigma that sometimes comes along with asking for support and asking for however that support might be defined. Can you talk to us a little bit about the stigma that goes along with that and how we might be able to combat that?
Yeah, absolutely. Stigma of support is huge. I think there's not many of us who have kind of dodged that bullet, as one could say. And, I think a good place to start with kind of demystifying the stigma piece around seeking support is first just demystifying the illusion that we're doing anything on our own in the first place.
Yeah.
You could look at something as mundane as my sweater. I didn't create this sweater without any support. How many people did it take to actually create my sweater? This is something that I'm wearing on an everyday basis. Or how many people did it take to get this mug and this cup of tea to me? A lot of people. If I can recognize that even the most mundane things, from my toothpaste tube to my sweater to my mug, to the salad that I'm eating, was absolutely not created alone, then I'm just kind of curious for us, what has it for us that we consider the most complex things in our human life, like emotional support, dealing with our emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being, needs to be done alone, if we don't even technically eat alone.
Right.
So I think that's kind of a really interesting starting point. And for me, reflecting in that way started shifting something in how I understood seeking support and getting support. We all need support to thrive. We all rely on each other to eat. We all rely on each other for our basic needs. So of course we also can and should, in a really powerful way, in a healthy way, rely on each other for our well-being in the emotional, spiritual, and mental realm. Yeah. So I think that's a good place to start. I think another powerful piece is those of us who are getting support, whether it's through therapists, coaches, healers, religious leaders, whatever kind of support you have in your life, if you are getting support and it's empowering you, it's working. I think we also, those of us who do get regular support, need to be more vocal about that, because we have this illusion in our culture that, one, we can all do it on our own. We're like this kind of take yourself up by your bootstraps, like go on, go forth, you can do everything, kind of like cowboy, cowgirl culture. And we don't have to do that. It's miserable to do it that way, by the way. It's so miserable, because oftentimes we're just, if you've ever had a situation where you were feeling challenged, and if you've ever noticed your thinking pattern, you often think the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So sometimes seeking support can simply just give you a different way of thinking around things. It can give you someone who is an impartial person, who's not as invested as your family and your friends, because even though they say they aren't, they are totally invested in a certain outcome. They have their own stuff that they place onto us.
Which sometimes can actually be the outcome that they want, can sometimes be you not changing.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I mean, as we kind of get more into this, that's absolutely the case when we start talking about power. But before we shift to kind of the power piece, most of us who are getting support need to speak out more and talk about that, and how it's okay, and how it's changing us, and how it's expanding us also. So those are a couple things. One, we need to acknowledge, like, we're never alone, because of basic things. Two, those of us who are getting support need to talk about it more, so that it just becomes a totally regular conversation. My dream in the future and my vision is that the way we talk about reaching out for emotional, mental, and spiritual support is basically as simple as, oh, I got my annual checkup, and that's it. And then it's just that normalized. It's not, you don't even bat an eyelash at it. But we're not there yet. So I think that's important for just all of us to acknowledge and own and not feel guilty about and not think it's just our story. This is social conditioning. This is society that has pressed this down onto us. And number three, that most of us, whether the person is living or has since passed, people that we admire likely had support or do have support. You know, one of the people that I love the most is Oprah Winfrey. And some people say that at any given time, she's even had up to 4 coaches at one time. I mean, that woman is amazing. She's marvelous. And she's marvelous because she has a wonderful team of support. She has people that help her to continue to expand and grow. And in reality, this was part of cultures for a long time, to
Right.
just have that embedded.
And I think that there's something to say about that, because the people that we admire, like you said, have likely had support. But there's something about somewhere in there, the stigma gets removed from the people that we have on our pillars or that we hold out as amazing. And I think sometimes the people that feel that we're little, or that we aren't leaders, or that we don't have power, we're still worried about what other people will think. And maybe some of those people that we look to as being amazing have long ago lost the fear of what other people think.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they had to, right? Imagine if someone at the like a level of, as far as how many people she's reaching and impacting on a regular basis, someone like Oprah was worrying about what other people think. I mean, she would have just totally shut down a long time ago. I heard this really powerful speech from her this summer that was from a long time ago, where she shared her story about moving into broadcast journalism. And everyone told her she was crazy. I mean, people told her that she wasn't going to be able to do it. And she just, what I love most about her when she shared the story is that she just was so dedicated to her own knowing, her own inner voice and her own truth regardless. And to have that from such a young age when she was first starting out, I have no doubt that that's carried forward, and that she's probably had support along the way when she's doubted that, that's helped to reinforce that, knowing that she doesn't have to buy into other people's stories. And the truth is if we're going to constantly worry about what other people think, which, I mean, hey, I get it. It's a constant battle, especially for those of us who have been socialized to be women or self-identify as women, that we're taught to think and worry about what other people think and put that first.
Yeah.
And so it requires consistent dedication to ourselves to say, no, I have to honor myself, because if I worry about what everyone else thinks, I basically will never win, because I can't make everyone happy. I can't. It's impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I almost think that we could go on a whole nother tangent too around support and the different kinds of support there are, because I think a lot of people just look at support as, laying on a therapist's couch and pouring out all of your life. And that's not the only option that there is for support. Maybe we can do some resources and you can provide some in that way to share with everyone who's watching. You brought up several times in what you just said around female power and leadership. What is your definition? And I want you to just riff on this because you've got so much to say. What's your definition of sovereignty and female power?
Yeah, this is like my favorite topic ever. Mainly because it is the topic that I have wrestled with most in my personal life, which then therefore shaped my coaching and healing practice.
Yeah.
And I had no idea that I had issues of power. First, I want to kind of back up before talking about what power is, and to say that for most of us who are women or self-identified women, that the word power feels yucky and scary and has a long connotation to it. So for many of us, our relationship to the idea of owning our power, which to me is just really, I love the word sovereignty, as you mentioned, because it's like being able to really stand fully in our statehood almost. It's really being able to stand fully rooted, grounded in our shoes, in our full selves, to stand almost unwaveringly, despite knowing that people will disagree with us, won't like what we have to say, won't like what we believe, what we're doing. Like, I mean, there's always going to be someone that doesn't like something about us. And instead of us taking that on, because I mean, essentially when somebody doesn't like something we say or something we do, then what we're doing, I like to use props, is kind of like we take that on and we start to own it like it's ours. And in that moment, what we've done is, if I say something and, let's just work here with us, I say something, you don't like what I say, and then your reaction to me, I start taking it really personal. In that moment, I start taking on that as my own. And then in essence, I've given my power away to that situation. I've basically said, you and your opinion is more powerful than what felt true for me in that moment. And it starts to just kind of erode my truth, my sense of trust in myself, my sense of knowing inside of myself. And that's where self-doubt, self-judgment starts to come in.
Well, and there's a couple of people who have really been talking about this last year and into 2018, and I know that Dr. Brene Brown is one of them, but talking about the definition of power and the huge difference between power over, which is a lot of what we've seen lately, a lot of power to, where people feel that they have to wait for power to be given to them, and then the opposite, which is probably part of sovereignty, is power with. Where you're not taking power from somebody else, you're just standing in your own alongside someone else's. So I like that.
Yeah, I love that kind of framing of it. And for me, I do really well with kind of imagery that works really strongly for me. So when I think of power and sovereignty, I think of like a very wise old woman who just, if you look at people who are elderly, who are wise, they just have this sense of knowing. And sometimes they have this beautiful silence and conversations and presence because they just know. And they also don't feel the need to have to say all that they know because they don't feel the need to prove anymore. And I think really ultimately as women grow into their full, sense of womanhood and what that means to them, it's eventually stepping into that. And some teachings, it's the kind of the archetype of the crone, the old wise woman who really just doesn't need to prove anything anymore and just fully owns herself, fully owns and inhibits her entire self. And so often in relationships for women, because we've been socialized to care about other people's needs, then we give that importance. And in that process, then we just kind of basically slowly give pieces of our power away, whether it's to words, to actions, to people, to situations, to decisions. And we kind of become like these self-sacrificing martyrs. And in many ways, our culture has kind of reveled and put that kind of behavior on a pedestal and seen that as, something to be proud of. But in reality, all of us who have done any sort of self-sacrificing martyrdom know that you just kind of basically in the end get totally burned out and left in a crumple on the floor and wonder what'd you do.
and then you repeat the cycle again.
That's right. Yeah, you have to repeat the cycle, and eventually you get to this place where you lose the sovereignty piece, is where you kind of start to lose where I am and where I begin and where you end and where you begin, and that's kind of where the boundaries piece comes in. And the challenge when you're starting as a woman and starting to try to explore your power is so often we go kind of, because of what you mentioned, the power over, because we've been mostly men have only been the ones that have been given permission, I would say, in society to own their power. They're powering over. And so then we see that model and then we kind of do our own version of that because that's the only thing we see. And when we did this, transition from women into the workplace with the whole feminist movement, we often started just kind of modeling this masculine behavior. But much of the masculine behavior is a very kind of wounded, powerless behavior. In general, I think both men and women in this place right now with Me Too and other conversations, we're basically having what I would call a power crisis. It's men realizing that they're having unhealthy expressions of power, usually this power over, and most of the time women having unhealthy expressions of power, being completely disempowered and denying their power, stuffing down their power, disconnecting from their power. Or if they're exercising their power, they're kind of doing it in a same way, different way as the men. where you're kind of building these walls and shutting people out and pressing out and needing to overly assert versus, kind of drawing boundaries and knowing you have the power to renegotiate those at any time, and no one can ever trample your boundaries because you kind of get to draw the lines in the sand and decide what they are.
So what would you say, because that's something that you and I have talked about before, and I have as a real concern of mine, is that we are going to see the rise of the feminine, and we're going to have all of this movement of get women in office, get women into leadership, get women into boardrooms, when that's not necessarily the way that we're made. We're not made to function inside of the confines of our government or politics necessarily. So what would you have to say around the discussion around gentle leadership, or making sure that the feminine piece of our power is brought in? Are there some practical tips? Because I know some people are going to be watching and going, this is all feels like too much. What are some small, and it is all a lot, but that's part of
Yes.
just dissecting it and going step by step and having these conversations.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first part of the soft and gentle piece is first just noticing, am I feeling the need, like just checking in with yourself first and noticing, am I feeling the need to like protect and assert a lot of the time? Because if I feel the need to like protect and assert, am I moving from this place of fear of, you're going to take all my time away, so I have to kind of protect and keep all this extra space in my schedule because you're going to steal all my space. If you're the kind of person who, let's say, usually many of us have this issue of overcommitting, then we often swing to the totally opposite end of like making all this space in the schedule.
I've never done that before.
All the space in the schedule, and then we become like this really intense like guardian of the night, like, he who comes to take 1 hour of my time, like, it's just we become so overly assertive, so protective, clamping down.
Yeah.
It's like all of a sudden we say no all the time to everything. No, 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 no. And that's often, I would say, the advice that's given is, it's okay to say no. Yes, it's okay to say no, but it doesn't mean that you have to now swing all the way to the other side and say no. So paying attention to if you're kind of all of a sudden swinging to the other extreme, I think is a first thing to check in on. And then really it's a matter of, I would say, trial and error and experimentation. What happens if instead of saying I need, 10 hours of blank time, if I maybe kind of dial it back and allow for some yeses and some nos today? And most importantly, just notice, how does it feel? At the end of the day, do I feel like I'm depleted? Do I feel energetically drained? If I feel depleted and drained, there's some sort of unhealthy power dynamic happening there. I either have given too much of myself and not honored my needs, and/or I'm doing this clamping down and I'm feeling kind of like victimized and assaulted on. And we have to kind of check in there. And that's, I think, a first kind of pulse check to kind of see where this kind of clamping down and pushing away is happening. Because it's usually like clamping down and pushing away and then letting go and all the things, and then clamping down and pushing away and then letting go and all the things. And the gentle feminine is kind of much more in the middle. Sometimes I kind of lean in, sometimes I lean back, but I'm never really fully leaning all the way in, and I'm never leaning all the way back, because it's much more balanced. It's much less hard and fast rules. And that's kind of hard for us. I think many of us want hard and fast rules, but leading with a feminine is not hard and fast. It's completely being in touch with the pulse of how you're feeling, honoring that, and in the same way, being willing to honor how other people feel and what they need at that moment.
Which is something that I feel, and not that men aren't, but that females are uniquely qualified to do, is taking the pulse of, and that's what we've been doing for centuries and centuries, is taking the pulse of others and ourselves. And I do think we've gotten away from that. I don't know when I would say it started, but definitely have gotten away from that in recent times.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think it has to start here first, because most of us have become experts because of the way that we're socialized at feeling the pulse of others, but not so good as women at feeling the pulse of what's happening inside of here. So one of the first things I think women can do is, pick up a notebook. I have my journal right here. This thing is like a sacred book to me. And I think all women should have a journal and a pen, and or if you don't like writing, you can use your phone. We have a lot of technology now. You can use your phone as an audio recording device. But just first, really having intimate conversations with yourself, just with yourself, about how I'm thinking, how I'm feeling, what I'm needing, and actually asking those kind of questions on a regular basis. And most importantly, I'd say being willing to write the scary stuff and or say the scary stuff for ourselves out loud is huge. And that's really, I think, the turning point where we start to pull our power back, because we're finally becoming that support that we've always needed and that we provide to everyone else, and we're starting to do it for ourselves.
Yeah, that's important. And I like that you talked about, like, not everyone likes to journal, and there's so much pressure on people to journal, especially women. Get out your journal and have that be part of your morning, and that's not for everybody. But using audio would be hugely helpful. There's also Future Me, which I use a lot. Have you ever heard of that, where you can write a letter to yourself in the future? And it's fascinating because it comes back to you then at a time that you set, and it can provide some amazing insight. So one of the things that I know then that happens when we start to do this work, we either start to step into our sovereignty, or we start to identify our leadership potential or our capacity, is there are other people in our lives that aren't used to the new you. What are some tips on that you would give if I asked you the question, what about the men? So if we're looking at a female or a self-identified female that is in relationship, close partnership with a man, how would you suggest that we start to address some of that rubbing up against each other that's likely to happen as sovereignty starts to be a part of a woman's life?
Yes, I think this is an important piece, and it's important to kind of go in without expectations. I would say no expectations that everything is going to be horrible, no expectations that everything's going to be great, no expectations that the man in your life is going to fully understand this, no expectations that the man in your life is going to fully not understand this. But the more that you continue to know yourself and have that pulse and have an open conversation with him about it, the more you can say the scary stuff to yourself and then say the scary stuff to him. For example, if you start to exercise your sovereignty in the sense of really understanding what you need in a relationship, what you need, for example, it often happens in cases where women are sharing their feelings that the men in their life struggle to hold space. And that's really what women need. In a place like that, women, all they actually need is just space held in a really loving way. It's really basic. That's what we need. We just need this beautiful space held. And so in moments when men are struggling to hold that space, they can do that in a lot of ways, like, walking out of the room or emotionally shutting down. And it's almost like, when my partner has done this in the past, it's literally like as if his spirit just goes and leaves somewhere else. And there's just this like dead, glazed look, there. Or I've had partners in the past who it's too much, and then they kind of try to shut it down, and they try to shut down the feelings. It's important to first just become familiar about how that dynamic operates, understanding how that happens. And in a moment like that, once you see it, if you've experienced that, let's say your partner leaves the room, something like journaling, writing a letter through a system like you were talking about, Future Me, audio recording, video recording, any sort of essence, any sort of expression, art, dance, something that helps you to get the emotional energy of the container out, then can give you a clear head and a space to then be able to see, okay, what do I really need? So that's important, because oftentimes what happens is, unfortunately, in a moment like that, when the man leaves the room, we then come back to the conversation and say, you left me and I I need a partner that does something different, and you need to know, and we kind of start doing this, which is again a power over experience. That's all we know. Rather than first of all, backing up and getting really clear, like what did I actually need in that moment? Why was that so triggering for me? So let's say they left, they walked out of the room. So they left and they walked out of the room. It's not really about the walking out of the room in that moment. It's really that you probably need connection when you're being vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right? And so if I know that for myself, underneath it, if I keep asking myself the question, a simple question of like, what's this really about? What's this really about? What's this really about? I really just wanted to feel he was going to connect with me, or I really just needed to know that it was okay to say the scary things I was feeling in that moment. I really just needed to say I was scared and for him to just receive it. Okay, I need connection. Then when I come back to the conversation, I can share that. However, before anything else, I think it's really important for women, for us to first understand what is it like for the men in our lives? What's happening when he's leaving the room? Why is he leaving the room? I mean, my original stories about why my partners would leave the room or emotionally check out is completely different than what was actually happening for them. I told myself stories, they don't care and they're getting bored and they're getting tired. They just want to shut me up. I mean, I'm sure many women are like, I have that story in my head.
Very rarely. I think there's some situations where it might be, but very rarely.
Very rarely. Exactly. Very rarely. Let's not forget that the men in our life we love, and we're in some sort of relationship, partnership, connection with them for a reason. So it's likely that they have goodwill in mind at that moment, and they're just doing the best that they can in the same way that we're trying to do the best that we can. So I think it's really important to then be able to come in to start having vulnerable conversations by first processing ourselves, because most often as women, we want to process with them in real time or even post facto. And honestly, it's just way too much at first. Way too much at first. Maybe something like that can develop later, but at the beginning, it's way too much for us to ask men to allow us to do all the processing. This is a big learning curve for most of them because they're not socialized to even be in touch with their own feelings. So how can we expect them to hold space for all the feelings that we have when we're more socialized to be allowed to feel? So we first need to kind of process so that we're no longer at the conscious level, but a little bit more at the subconscious level. So we actually understand for ourselves what's going on. And that's how we can then enroll and slowly teach the men in our lives what we actually need and actually ask for what we need, and also understand in return, empowering for them to understand what they need, so that when I come into a conversation, I understand that when my partner leaves the room, I really need to feel connected. I understand that when my partner leaves the room, there's something happening for them in that moment. I'm going to come into the conversation after everything is not heightened and triggered, but calmed down, and ask curiously, like with a genuine curiosity, what happens for you in the conversation like that? We were talking yesterday about how I was feeling, and you walked out of the room. What happened for you? What were you feeling? What were you thinking in that moment? What does that mean for you? I'm really curious to know. That's important because most often we come from this place of blame, right? But in that space, we're just genuinely curious about that experience and willing to receive it. Then from there, if I listen and I receive and I understand, probably, likely, in that scenario, my partner maybe just needed a moment of space. It was way too much to process for him at that moment. He just needed a pause, and he didn't know how else to create a pause or even how to ask for a pause. He just left the room. Then I can understand, okay, how would it be different if in a moment like that, when we're having a conversation and you're feeling overwhelmed, would you feel willing to ask for a pause? And if we gave the conversation a pause, would you be able to continue the conversation? Maybe there's a yes there. And then that person is given pause, and I'm continue to have connection instead of feeling abandoned.
Well, and I think there's a lot of situations also where we don't do a very good job of even stating what we need
Yes.
in the conversation, like saying, I need to have a conversation or I need to share something. A lot of times we do that whole assuming that they're going to know exactly what we're thinking. Yeah, there's so much in all of this. And it all, like you said at the beginning, it comes back to our work that we have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. The assumption piece is huge. That's, I think, the biggest hurdle for women. We assume that men understand and know what's going on in our head, and they don't. We assume that we know what's going on in their head, and we don't. So it's really beautiful to just kind of come off of that kind of that place of how we've been socialized and kind of step back and just say, let me even not assume what I think is going on for myself. Let me be willing to be curious and see what's happening for myself. Let me be willing and curious to see what's happening for him. And then let's be curious as a couple what's happening for us and what could be possible from us for us from there. Then we're kind of moving outside of the constraints because into our power when we haven't really shifted what's happening inside, we don't create this kind of open container that I'm speaking about, where we're really first, I would say, interested in kind of what's happening in the other person's experience after getting clarity for ourselves. Then we tend to kind of unintentionally go into the old dance. And what we're doing is we're trying to invite our partner to, metaphorically walk into a field that they've never walked into before. And neither have we. Yeah. And so to really be able to do that, we need to show up differently for ourselves. We need to show up differently for them. Over time, we teach people how we want to be treated. And so if I go into a conversation and I genuinely am curious about how my partner feels, over time, my partner will start to likely do the same in his own way. Yeah. With me.
I like that. So the unfortunate piece of all of this is that we are at the end of our time.
So much to say on this, I know.
I know, and we didn't even get to the part about the next generation. So maybe in the conversation after our listeners and our retreat participants have a chance to watch this, maybe in the dialogue and the subsequent conversation, we can talk a little bit more also about how to model all of this for the next generation. Marci, if you would just share one last thing with us, what is one of your personal mantras or the ways that you reset personally when you've got a lot going on and it's just, you need to be able to step back or step aside? What's one way that you do that?
One of my favorite ways is one of the first practices I ever took on, which is a 2-question process, which is, or there might even be 3 questions I'm going to say. So the first one is, I will just pause when I start to notice I'm getting really triggered. I'm starting to react inside of myself and I'm in a conversation with someone, whether it's my partner or someone else. And I'll start to just pause and say, what's going on here? And that simple question starts to give me space. It may be probably in that moment, a story starts to emerge in my mind. And then my favorite 2 questions after that is this true? Of which, by the way, the answer is always no. Sometimes though, my mind gets really stubborn and says the answer is yes. And in that moment, I'll ask myself.
Hands on your hips.
Yeah, with hands on my hips. Yes, this is true. And then in that moment, I'll ask myself, okay, so maybe it's true, but is this helpful? Is the story that I have about the situation, this other person, how things are going, helpful? And again, the answer for that one by that time, I'm usually can acknowledge is no. And so then I'll ask myself what could be helpful. And that process just gives me space from my reaction and allows me to start kind of pulling back and to be that kind of curious, open observer to be able to start kind of checking my assumptions and not get lost in them.
There's my alarm to be present. It's for when my children walk in the door from school.
Oh, good.
So on that note, thank you so much for joining us. I am looking forward to all the conversation because this is really important stuff. And I think it's going to be valuable to have the discussion around sovereignty and our power. Thank you, Marci.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, thanks.